Hi, class. Today we're going to discuss Judith Jarvis Thomson's discussion of the trolley problem. But before we do that, I think this article, among uh, out of many of the ones we'll read this semester, is very important to situate and really kind of focus on why this kind of thought and process is important. Because if you don't realize that, and at a quick glance, it could be one of those kind of things that gives philosophy a bad name with all these abstract and unrealistic scenarios. And so we're going to talk about it, why it's important, really in two parts. Part one, and I cannot emphasize this enough, is the purpose of a thought experiment. Because that's what these examples are. The purpose of a thought experiment is to figure out exactly what our moral commitments are. Let me take a really, really simplified case. The next two readings we'll do after this are actually about abortion. But suppose someone said, well, imagine a case of abortion where um, the mother was guaranteed to die and the fetus was guaranteed to die if the pregnancy is brought to terms. Would you oppose abortion then? And I've never met someone who said yes. Uh, and first of all, these scenarios are pretty rare. That kind of thing doesn't happen very often. But the very fact that we've articulated it and thought of kind of this rare and abstract scenario makes me realize, well, no, I can't just categorically say all abortions are bad and leave it at that. Instead, uh, I have to start thinking about cases that are different morally. Well, what about one where the fetus is guaranteed to die, but the mother is not? What about one where vice versa, etc.? And so, the first and foremost point of a thought experiment is to figure out exactly where we have moral commitments, where we don't, and realize when we have to draw some sort of line. And when we say draw a line, what we're really talking about is teasing out our moral principles. What things are we actually committed to in ethics? And answering that kind of question is hugely important. Um, one of the things we're really bad at as human beings is acting according to principles. So, well, of course, I think that drunk driving is wrong, but then all of a sudden I'm tempted when I'm at the bar and I've maybe had one too many and I don't want to pay for a taxi home, and all of a sudden I'm trying to undermine my own views. And one of the so that's what we might call exceptional thinking, thinking that you're somehow the exception to a moral rule. And exceptional thinking in that way is one of the top opponents of ethics and one of the things that prevents us from being good, morally upstanding people. And a really good way to combat that is to think long and hard about what our moral principles actually are and be sure to articulate them and articulate the reasons why we have them as just part of our development as moral beings. And so, never lose the forest through the trees. The point of a thought experiment is never to be, well, if you actually happen to find yourself in the scenario, you'll know how to act. No, instead, it's trying to draw out the principles of action that you should uphold. And so when a hard situation comes up, you'll know what your principles and beliefs are and be able to act according to them. And especially with the trolley problem is fundamentally about weighing lives against other lives. And believe it or not, that's something that you encounter all the time, um, to the point it might even be on a daily basis. Well, how do I weigh these things? I could give extra money to St. Jude's Hospital, which does great work for children with cancer in the U.S., but I could also spend that money on Oxfam, which we'll talk about in the next unit, as as an organization that's going to save money a lot cheaper. Save lives a lot cheaper. And so, if I donate $1,000 to St. Jude, I'm effectively saving 1/200th of a life. If I donate $1,000 to Oxfam, I'm probably saving 50 lives. Probably not quite that many, but it's pretty cheap to save a life through Oxfam. And so that's one way in which we weigh lives against another. But think about policies that you vote for that, well, spending money on health care saves lives in certain ways. The Central Budgeting Office tells us that if we cancel the Affordable Care Act, it'll kill 18,000 people, versus spending that money in other ways that might also save or cost lives. Think about your decisions based on carbon footprint. Think about just all sorts of your everyday decisions ultimately have ramifications involving weighing lives against others. They really do. And so, how do we do that? That is a kind of a nightmare scenario. For one more example, think about how much a city spends on police or protective equipment for police versus education programs and things like that. These are hard issues, and or even think of electricity to take a really simple case. Electricity kills people and it saves lives. So what do we do with that? Et cetera, et cetera. And so these are not rare situations if we isolate the principle of how do we weigh lives against each other. So I know that was kind of a long and rambling introduction, but there's some important stuff here. Our goal is to tease out these principles because we must learn to act consistently according to our moral principles. And they're not that uncommon in terms of when we need to invoke these principles. So that's thing one. Now, why are we doing that particularly in this unit, even though it seems to be a lot about consequentialism? Two things. Notice the kind of topic for the week is ethics is hard in some senses. And we need to realize there are thorny problems out there, not insurmountable problems, but problems that require our utmost care, thought, and attention, because too often people will simply dismiss, oh, of course I know what's right in the situation. Well, no. And so part of the reason for this article and why you get so many head scratches in all these different types of scenarios is because each of these scenarios is morally different, and I think that Jarvis Thomson does a really good job of drawing that out. And this is kind of culminating in one of the perennial problems in ethics, which is rights versus utilities, and we'll get to that at the end. Sorry. And so, important article, an important topic, and things that really do deserve our care and attention. So, after that 8-minute prologue, let's talk about the trolley problem. First of all, notice that the trolley problem is not original to Jarvis Thomson. It was developed, and she is responding to another ethicist, Philippa Foot, and in Foot's work, she describes this problem where, well, trolley's out of control. If I keep going forward, it kills 5 people. If I change track, it kills 1 person. Immediately, we might say, well, of course, it's okay in that specific weird case to change the track to kill 1 person to save 5. But as soon as you say that, you seem to have just given people license to do something that seems obviously wrong, which is kill a person to harvest their organs. There's a lot of lives to be saved. You get 2 lungs, actually more than 5. 2 lungs, 2 liver lobes, 2 kidneys, heart, etc. And so if we simply say, well, of course it's okay to kill 1 to save the 5, we don't want to say that. And in fact, we can't say that. And Jarvis Thomson really isolates, well, the genuine trolley problem is, assuming it is okay to switch the track, why is it okay to switch the track, but it's not okay to kill somebody to harvest the organs? And so that's really going to be the kind of central problem, but really the solution to the problem tells us a lot about how and when we can weigh lives against one another. And that's the really thick and meaty, philosophically interesting paper. I can combine 6 metaphors. Um, so that's what's going on. Now, Foote, the original one who wrote about the trolley problem, we might encounter her with Neo-Aristotelianism later. Foote seems to think the biggest difference is between killing and letting die, and that's this certain moral difference. And so the surgeon would be killing, whereas in the trolley problem you would be letting die. And there's something tempting and nice about that. We certainly do want to distinguish morally cases of killing and letting die, and kind of flag that in your notes because we're going to return to that issue with utilitarianism and with Bernard Williams in the next unit. But Jarvis Thomson rightly points out things aren't that simple. First of all, she was skipping ahead a little. In section 4, she tells us killing and letting die are just too clunky a terms to really help. Because notice, killing isn't the same as murder. And things like, well, is a trolley driver driving an out-of-control trolley actually killing? Or is turning a switch letting die? These are just kind of vague commitments. So while it is certainly true that killing and letting die should be viewed differently morally, we can't rest our case on that because there's simply more to it. These terms are, to use her words, too blunt. And so that's when you get these kind of complicated examples that we can make the surgeon one more complex in a way that kind of dissolves the killing and letting die distinction. And that's what Jarvis Thomson is going to use to motivate another approach. So we might also start with, she introduces the next hiccup in the trolley problem is the switch person. Somebody doesn't have to work for the rail line, who's standing next to the switch can throw it. And notice there the switch person actually is in an important sense killing, because if they hadn't done anything, then there'd still be death. And so the switch person, it seems, says Jarvis Thomson, that it's okay for the switch person to change the trajectory and to kill the one person. Well, there it seems to be a case of killing, and yet still doesn't seem like a problem. So we not only have the killing and letting die distinction being too blunt, but then these more complicated cases that are introduced in section 3 also cast doubt on this even more basic principle. Forget killing and letting die. Can't we agree that killing 5 is worse than killing 1? And the answer with these more complicated scenarios with the surgeon seemed to be no. In fact, there do seem to be cases where that does not seem right. And so once more, because killing is simply too blunt, we cannot just say killing 5 is worse than killing 1. We have to think this through more carefully. These scenarios are more nuanced. And so ultimately, her conclusion, Jarvis Thomson's conclusion, comes up in section 5, although it's really very thoroughly elaborated afterwards. For Jarvis Thomson, there are 2 relevant differences. And before I get to those relevant differences, it's not that either one by themselves does the job, it's that those 2 together, these 2 differences, when we combine them, can account for why it's okay to throw the switch to kill the one, and it's not okay to kill someone to harvest their organs. First and foremost, It the first difference is that the trolley problem saves lives by changing a threat rather than say creating one. The ball is already in the air, so to speak. It looks like somebody's going to die regardless, and by one specific cause, and we can just try to minimize the deaths that come from that one specific cause. Um, and so she says, in elaborating that in section 6, that this is really about minimizing deaths of something that's already killing. And so we see that all the time. To take a very close to home example right now, COVID's already killing. We're not going to fault hospital workers for making, say, bed selections based on what's going to save the most lives. And so we have this kind of homogenous threat that, well, it's the same threat regardless of whether it kills 5 or kills 1. And so really we're just re-angling the threat to minimize the damage. But that's not enough, because she introduces yet another scenario, and this is where things get really wild, or if you don't realize the importance of thought experiments. Well, what if I know enough about trolley physics that I could push this tremendously obese person over the rail, and that would kill 1 to save the 5? Well, that's why just saying the threat's already there isn't enough. Now, why does she say that? Because she thinks that most people have the intuition that pushing the person in front of the trolley is wrong in a way that throwing the switch is not. And so if you share that intuition, you'll realize that, well, what's missing is we have to talk about something involving rights. And so the second difference is that we can save lives without threatening rights. And so let's we already know where this is going in some senses, because theoretically we should have done the reading. But first of all, this is where we have to get into the pure rights versus, pure utility versus rights discussions that will come up a lot in ethics. And so we're starting to motivate that issue by realizing that there are 2 different things of value going on here, and at least in this situation, it seems like the consideration of right trumps utility, and so murdering someone to save a life would be wrong in this kind of case, really in any case, for Thomson or Jarvis Thomson, because murder is a violation of rights in addition to killing. So, why though, and this is where it's a little tricky and she has to walk you through it in section 7, why is it the case that, well, murdering someone takes away their rights? Well, why is throwing the switch not murder? And this is a fine line she has to walk, but there seems to be something to her solution. In the case where you're pushing the fat man over the edge, they have to die in order to save the lives. That is, this person must perish and must lose their right to life in order to achieve the outcome of saving 5 lives, similar to the surgeon case. By contrast, all that's required in the other case is flipping a switch, and whether there's someone on the tracks or not, it actually saves the 5 lives. And so the person on the tracks is in some sense incidental. And it's really the flipping of the switch that actually saves the lives. And so that's how she attempts to get around that. I will say one of the things you could talk about in the discussion board is whether that a lot hinges on that distinction. And so whether you think that Jarvis Thomson is successful or not in really more drawing out the moral difference between those 2, that's one of the trickier points in this Trolley Problem article. But moving ahead to section 8, we have to be really careful though, because Well, if rights always trump utilities, then you have some really stupid seeming to some people uh, things problems here. So she mentioned a few of the ones she's heard before. Well, what if I need to take someone's letter opener without asking, and uh, in order to operate the switch? Well, if rights trump utilities, I'm not allowed to use that. And you could come up with a million scenarios like that. Well, what if I need to, just something as simple as taking someone's handkerchief, or et cetera, et cetera. Um, there, in Jarvis Thomson says she doesn't share those intuitions, but she's willing to kind of stipulate, because what she can really say is, well, uh, we can still talk about degrees of rights, and she talks about stringent versus trivial. And all she needs to say is um, that we don't have to threaten any stringent rights, and she could let go a lot of those lighter scenarios. Um, but having said that, there's something important in Section 8 that I'd like to circle back to. She also points out that nothing is gained by assuming rights are inviolable. There's no satisfactory account of rights that says right can never be violated. To imagine how crazy this is, what if you thought the right to property was inviolable? And you can imagine, and this is again the kind of purpose of thought experiments. Well, I can imagine a scenario in which I need to, you know, take someone's piece of some cheap uh, bauble, so some button off of their shirt, and use it to literally prevent the destruction of the whole planet. And if I don't do that without their permission, the world ends. Are you really going to say that I did something wrong there? That would be crazy. And so, however we cash out the debate between rights and utilities, start with the fundamental assumption, as Jarvis Thomson does, and she's a big fan of rights over utility, that nothing is gained by rights or inviolable. And so, um, overall, the trolley problem, really interesting problem, because how do we go about weighing lives, and how do we do so in a way that's consistent, but at the same time recognizes different kinds of cases, is hugely important. Um, let's start with a very relevant one. Wearing masks saves lives. Nope, no dispute whatsoever in the scientific community there. Um, and yet, people have tried to make it a rights issue. So, how do I weigh uh, the right to various, I don't know, freedoms involving what you're allowed to wear and what have you, against utility? Or, well, we also know that going to church congregations get people killed right now during COVID. And so, how might we weigh these rights of religious assemblage to death? Because it's not just the people going to these religious assemblies that are dying, but people they come into contact with later. And these are hard questions. And things like the trolley problem start getting us thinking. And one of the things we have to think about is rights versus utilities. When is it okay to violate someone's right to save a life? And here's a couple of things you could write about today. So obviously you could always just write about your general thoughts on the topic. What do you think about Jarvis Thomson's solution to the trolley problem, etc. But if you want to stretch your brain a little more, uh, start with some explicit scenarios where rights and utilities come into conflict, and talk about which one trumps the other and why. Um, that's a really good way to start thinking about what your moral principles are. If you even want to use some thought experiments to try to draw a line there, we will. Uh, Looking forward a little bit, we're going to, in Unit 2, look at some theories of ethics that kind of minimize rights to maximize utility. and then we'll look at some that go the other way later in the semester. So that would all be fun stuff to talk about, though. The other thing I would like to mention is we're going to do our first really applied ethics for the next two readings. So we'll look at an article on one side, an article on another side involving abortion, which is one of the really hard ethical issues. So again, we're putting it in Unit 1 to realize ethics can be hard. There are some genuine, legitimately tricky issues out there. It demands our best intellectual capacities and rigor and consistent thinking. But in doing so, we will have some payoffs in our lives. So that's what we're working towards, and we will see you next time.